Our lecture for today begins our section on basic ethical principles. And for this semester, we will specifically examine 5 common principles that have been developed by philosophers and ethicists for the purpose of grounding moral beliefs and actions. So the first principle we'll look at is utilitarianism. This utilitarian principle promotes collective happiness. That is, from a utilitarian perspective, the correct thing to do in any given action or any given circumstance is to do whatever brings the most amount of happiness for the most amount of people. Second is the libertarian principle. The libertarian principle says that the correct thing to do in any given circumstance is whatever protects the rights of individuals. So now when we're looking at the utilitarian principle, you could imagine circumstances where you might have to sacrifice the rights of an individual so that the majority of people will either be happy or so that you can reduce the amount of suffering for the majority of people. But according to the libertarian principle, that would be problematic because the libertarian principle states that the fundamental principle that we ought to govern our lives by is that which protects the rights of every individual. Each individual ought to be free to do whatever that individual wants to do, provided that the individual does not infringe upon the rights of someone else. That is the libertarian principle. Next, we have the deontological principle, and this approach to ethics was proposed by the philosopher Immanuel Kant, where he argued that we need to promote categorical rules. Now we'll talk more about what this means later on in the semester, but you can think of simple rules like do not lie or do not murder. Kant argued that there are certain rules that ought to be followed and ought to be honored regardless of the consequences. And so Kant argued against a consequentialist approach to ethics, which is actually what utilitarianism is. We'll talk about that in a second. But when it comes to ethics, there are certain rules, there are certain laws that ought to be honored, and we shouldn't take into account the consequences of the actions because the consequences have nothing to do concerning the moral values of a particular action. Then we'll look at the egalitarian principle, which promotes a principle of equality behind what John Rawls called the veil of ignorance. Now, the veil of ignorance is this state of existence before you're born. So you're welcome to do a thought experiment where you should imagine what life was like before you were born. So if you were not thrown into this existence, and you don't know whether you're going to be born into a rich family or a poor family, you don't know whether or not you're going to be born to the majority or to a minority group. If you don't know what your lot in life is going to be, that is, if you're behind this veil of ignorance, what type of principles would you set up to govern society? Well, Rawls argued that the rational thing to do would be to set up a principle of equality. And this principle states that if you're born into a wealthy family, or if you're born with ambitions and you're driven to success and you happen to be somebody who works hard and succeeds in life, you will want to be rewarded for your efforts. And so with the principle of equality, we can set up systems that allow people who work hard or who are born into privilege to enjoy the fruits of their labor or the fruits of the labor of their parents, but never to the detriment of those who are the least well off. Because some people are born in circumstances that are not ideal, and so we also want to create a system where those who are not in those ideal situations, that they can still have some opportunities in life and that they would not be left behind. And so later in this semester, we're going to be talking about the egalitarian principle. And then last, we're going to look at virtue ethics. This approach to ethics promotes an instrumentalist view of ethics, which simply means before you know what is right or what is just or what is good, you need to know what the purpose of a thing is. So this will be relevant when we get to our section on same-sex marriage, because the political and social arguments that have been debated around that particular topic utilize a virtue approach to ethics. So, for example, those who argue against same-sex marriage typically have an argument that is based on the idea of this institution is made for a particular purpose, and when you argue that way, when you argue about the definition of a thing or the purpose of a thing, you are taking a virtue approach to ethics. And so we'll talk about that later in the semester as well. But for our lecture today, we are looking at the utilitarian principle. So again, the utilitarian principle promotes collective happiness. And one way to think about these different ethical principles is to think of them as a way of grounding all of our moral beliefs. So, for example, earlier on in the semester, we talked about the ethical dilemma of the trolley cart. Should we save 5 lives or 1 life? Well, many of you likely would agree with the proposition that it is morally right to save 5 lives over 1 life. Now, if you do agree with this principle, then we might ask, what justifies this belief? If you are a utilitarian, then you could appeal to the utilitarian principle. It seems like this moral proposition will produce the greatest amount of happiness for the greatest number of people. Or, to state it negatively, this approach will reduce suffering for the greatest amount of people. To argue this way is to see the utilitarian principle as a properly basic belief. And we use this properly basic belief or foundational belief to ground our various moral beliefs, our moral propositions, and our moral actions. This approach to ethics is a consequentialist approach to ethics, which simply means that we know right and wrong by determining the consequences of an action or belief in question. Take, for example, the proposition, we ought to respect the rights of individuals. This sounds like a libertarian principle, but notice that the justification in this situation, the justification of this belief, is still a utilitarian justification. If you argue that we ought to respect the rights of individuals, because doing so will promote the greatest happiness for the greatest number of people, then you are what's called a consequentialist libertarian, meaning that you do not take individual rights as a fundamental principle, rather, you have a belief that we ought to respect individual rights, and you justify that belief by appealing to the utilitarian principle. And so foundationally, the person who argues this way is actually a utilitarian who promotes individual rights. And so make sure that you make the distinction between beliefs that you have and then the fundamental principles that you use to ground those beliefs. So now, as we're looking at the utilitarian approach to ethics, it's helpful to look at the one who first articulated this position. His name is Jeremy Bentham, and Bentham was an eccentric character. You see in the picture on your screen his auto icon. This is Bentham's actual body, which is still preserved for us today by his request. He had a will for his body to be dissected and mummified after his death, and he had hoped that his actual head would have remained attached to his body. However, they were not successful of keeping his head on top of his body, so they had to make a wax head instead to place on his body, and what they did after that is they placed his actual head between his feet, as you see in the picture. But before Bentham became a mummy, he wrote that nature has placed mankind under the governance of two sovereign masters, pain and pleasure, and it's for them alone to point out what we ought to do. Now, Bentham argued that if this is true, then ethics is actually a science. Because once we've determined how to measure the amount of pain and pleasure that's observed in a particular action, then we can determine what's right to do in every situation. Now, Bentham also argued that emotion is more important than reason when it comes to ethics. And this is important because many philosophers before Bentham, dating back to Plato, argued that reason was always more reliable than emotions when it came to making ethical decisions. But Bentham argues just the opposite, because for Bentham, the sensations of pain and pleasure are emotional sensations, they're feelings. And those sensations are the basis of ethics. That is, for Bentham, if we're not talking about emotions, then we're not talking about ethics. What else would we be talking about when we talk about whatever it means to live the good life or the moral life? Now, Bentham recognized that he could not prove that morality was about pain and pleasure or that it was about happiness, but he did argue that the chain of justification needs to stop somewhere. So let's suppose we are talking about moral action X. Let's call it the proposition that I believe that studying for my exam is a good thing to do because it's responsible. Well, someone might challenge me and say, well, why do you think that we ought to be responsible? Well, if somebody challenged me in that way, I might offer them justification X. And for our purposes here, we might say that justification X is the proposition that by studying and by being responsible, it's a necessary ingredient to becoming a successful person. So I want to be responsible because I want to become a successful person. But of course, someone might argue against me again and say, well, why should you seek to become a successful person? Well, I might then respond with another justification, call it justification Y, and I might say, well, because I want to save enough money so that I can retire at an early age and then live a comfortable life. Well, now, if somebody pushes me again and asks me to justify that belief, why should I pursue comfort in life? Well, then I might give a final justification, justification Z. And I might just say, well, because I want to be happy. Now, at this point, if someone asks, well, why should you pursue happiness? Bentham responds, because this is the final justification. This is our basic assumption. The buck has to stop somewhere for Bentham, and Bentham asks, where better to stop our final justification than by appealing to happiness? So happiness is the basis of ethics. Pain and pleasure is the way that we measure happiness. And from here, after establishing this idea, Bentham comes up with his principle of utility. And this is the principle which approves or disapproves of every action whatsoever according to the tendency which it appears to augment or diminish the happiness of the party whose interest is in question. Now, once this principle is established, Bentham then goes on to explain his pleasure-pain calculus. So this turns the principle into a science of ethics. When attempting to determine whether or not an action leads to pain or to pleasure, here are the factors that Bentham argues that you must keep in mind. First, you have to keep in mind the intensity of the pain and the pleasure. Some actions will lead to intense pain, whereas other actions will lead to pain, but that pain won't be so intense. You also have to factor in the duration of the pain or the pleasure that's being caused. So if you have an intense pain, but that intense pain only lasts for 5 seconds, that of course is not as bad as having intense pain that lasts for months. After we consider the intensity and duration, Bentham then argues that we must consider whether or not an action will certainly lead to pain or pleasure, or whether it's uncertain what the outcome will be. So if you commit an action that will certainly lead to pleasure, then that would be considered a morally good act. But if you are uncertain what will come about from your actions, then that is maybe a morally neutral act. Next, he talks about the closeness or remoteness. And so here Bentham is talking about if you commit an action that affects somebody in your immediate family. That would be, in terms of proximity, somebody that you're affecting close to you. That should be factored in more than affecting somebody, say, on the other side of the world. So here Bentham's argument is, if you do something that brings pain to, say, a family member, but that same action brings pleasure to someone on the other side of the world, you should give greater weight to the pain that you're bringing to your family member because they are closer to you than someone on the other side of the world. And so Bentham always favors closeness over remoteness. The next thing to consider is the short-term and long-term effects of our actions. Some of our actions bring about short-term pleasure and long-term pleasure. And some of our actions bring about short-term pain and then are followed by long-term pain. Other actions, however, are more complicated. There are some actions that bring about pleasure in the moment, but lead to long-term pain. Consider, for example, eating an entire box of Oreos. That action may cause you short-term pleasure, but it will likely lead to long-term pain and discomfort. On the other hand, there are some actions that bring about pain in the short term, but may lead to pleasure down the road. An example of this might be working out at a gym. In the short term, working out may cause some discomfort and therefore may cause some pain, but it can also bring about greater pleasure down the road. And so Bentham argues that when looking at these types of scenarios, we should always privilege the long-term pleasures over the short-term pleasures. And then last, Bentham talks about the extent of an action. And what he's talking about here is in any given action, we need to consider how many people are being affected using this calculus. So after Bentham works out this pain-pleasure calculus, he then talks about pain and pleasure in terms of units or lots. If an action causes 1 unit of pain, or let's say 1 unit of pleasure, it's important to remember that Bentham is taking into account everything that we've discussed in the previous slide. And so, taking that into consideration, let's look at a particular moral action. Let's say serving at a soup kitchen. Let's pretend for the sake of argument that someone named Jill is planning to serve at a soup kitchen, but doing so will bring Jill 3 units of pain. If this is the only data that we have, then Jill should not serve at the soup kitchen because, according to the calculus, it would be immoral to do so. But now let's suppose we add someone else into the equation. Let's call her Rose. If that same action brings Rose 4 units of pleasure, then Jill should serve at the soup kitchen because once you've added up the totals, this action will bring about 1 unit of pleasure. So you can expand this idea, you can expand this calculus, at least theoretically, to incorporate a whole society. Well, some of the earliest critiques of Bentham complained that his approach was too impractical. So even if this approach could be developed in theory, how would we put this into practice? To understand how a utilitarian might respond to this, we can now look at a student of Bentham's, John Stuart Mill. Now, John Stuart Mill brings some helpful clarifications to the utilitarian principle. First, he simply acknowledges that while many are critical of the happiness principle, He reiterates the fact that there is simply no other way to articulate what is meant by a moral faculty. To understand what he means by this, let's consider an earlier lecture where we looked at Sam Harris's moral landscape. In that lecture, Harris compares the concept of health with the concept of ethics. So we might understand Mill's idea in a similar way. Happiness is a starting principle for ethics, just like health is a starting principle for, say, the medical profession. So he reaffirms what Bentham was arguing, that if you don't start with happiness, or if you don't start with pleasure, then we're simply not talking about ethics, in the same way that if you're not talking about health, you're not talking about medicine. He then considers some of the common critiques. And so here are some common critiques formed in a question. So is the pursuit of pleasure or happiness simply a superficial pursuit? Shouldn't ethics have more depth than just what makes us happy or what brings us pleasure? And so some critiqued that swines also have emotions. They also feel. Why would we privilege humans over swine? What makes us different? And so they would argue that this doctrine is worthy only of swine. That would be animals that just feel things but don't have rational faculties. Well, Bentham responds by clarifying the utilitarian principle, and he does this by focusing on the quality of pleasures, not simply the quantity of pleasures. And so when articulated this way, Mill argues that what we're talking about is probably not something that we can calculate. And so he will distance himself from Bentham, and there's not necessarily a science of ethics here. But if it's something about the quality that we're talking about, then this is not merely a superficial concept. And so Bentham goes on to say that when you focus on the quality of pleasure, perhaps the highest form of pleasure is spending one's life in the service of others, in order that you might promote a happy society. Or we could put this in a different way. Perhaps the highest form of pleasure is spending one's life trying to reduce suffering throughout the world. And this type of life is not a superficial life, but it's actually a life that's being lived to the fullest. So while we can't calculate this, at least according to Mill, the principle of living for the collective happiness is still the principle that makes the most sense out of the discipline of ethics. And so Mill did not see this as a superficial doctrine. So now we move on to our discussion board for this week. We are going to test this utilitarian assumption with a case study. In the content tab on D2L, you will find videos about the ethics of torture. And I want you to discuss whether or not the utilitarian principle is helpful in determining whether or not torture is ever justified. So for your discussion, you must assume that torture is effective for retrieving information that would save the lives of thousands or millions of people. If this assumption is correct, then is torture justified? What ethical principles would you use to answer a question like this, if not the utilitarian principle? Do you think the utilitarian principle is the best principle for this circumstance, or do you find it problematic? Take time to watch the videos and discuss these questions in your group.